Hello, welcome everyone to our next Adult Literacy XPRIZE webinar session. We have another great one lined up for you. So this is the Impact Games Design. Don't forget that you can ask questions. So just go into the little Q&A app that you can find once you're logged in here, and feel free to submit your questions. I'll take a look at those, and then I will turn those over to Emily as appropriate. So today we have Emily Treat. She's the VP of Production Services for Games for Change. And again, she's going to be talking about impact games design. So Emily, over to you. Thank you so much.
Great. Hi, everybody. Thank you for welcoming me and having me. So yeah, I'm here to talk to you a little bit about game design and the game design processes that we use at Game for Change. So first, I'm just going to give you a little bit of background for those of you who may not be familiar. Games for Change started as a festival several years ago, where we were really just honoring the different types of games in the space and trying to give spotlight and attention towards the different developers and game designers that were working in this space. And now, 13 years later, we have an annual festival where we bring together all of the different types of people that it takes to build these games, which we'll be talking about a little bit later. And definitely encourage you to come if you're in the New York area. Then Games for Change began working more deeply in the community, not just giving out awards, but also showcasing and highlighting the different games that were coming out of this community. And this is for all different types of impact. We have games on education, games for health, games about social issues, raising awareness, behavior change, and we try to really highlight these through our website and give the different developers platforms for showcasing their games. We also have a Games and Media Summit that we have partnered with the Tribeca Film Festival. We will be hosting this year in April. Again, if you're in the New York area, I encourage you to come. We'll be showcasing some of the new technologies in the space. So we'll be playing with a lot of the new cool Oculus Rifts and 3D technologies. So it'll be really exciting. And then we have Games for Change is really expanded into kind of working across the sector in a number of different ways. And so one of the things we do, in addition to kind of highlighting the best and brightest in the field, is also working with researchers and funders and assessment teams to bring knowledge and share knowledge across the community. So quickly going to go through a few, 10 reasons why. I think that probably a lot of our audience is familiar with this and maybe has drank the Kool-Aid. So I'm not going to go into too much detail with this, but just to kind of give you an overview of why we feel like Games for Change can be effective forms of impact for behavior. They're participatory, this idea of this lean forward activity. You're making decisions with consequences that result in player agency. This sense of you're not a passive participant in this media. The sense of role playing, enabling people to step into different roles, to build awareness and empathy around different issues and cultures. We love games because they have challenges and rewards. I think one of the first things we always hear when we ask people how they define games is that they have rewards and point systems. And this idea of rewards and challenges, though, is really tied deeply to the engagement of the game, and sustaining that player engagement around a specific topic is all tied to that system of rewards and challenges. Games can be fun to fail in a classroom setting. Students can be very frustrated when they have to practice content over and over again. But if you give them a game sequence to play it through, it gives them an opportunity to kind of fail in a safe place and fail in a fun way. Oops, sorry. Games are social. This idea that you can play peer-to-peer or collaboratively, you can compete with people. The notion of tying in social elements into learning and education, behavior change can be incredibly powerful. And this idea of games as a service, we see increasingly use of software as service models, especially in the education space, where not only will the game be built and launched, but then it needs to be maintained, and content is continually pushed out for that game. And that service model is very adaptable into a classroom setting where you can imagine there's lots of curriculum to cover and there's lots of content to cover. Complexity, so this idea of a system of rules and navigating through those rules to get to an outcome is something that people find very compelling, and that idea of challenging themselves to get to the end point. And then number 8 is one that we talk a lot about at Games for Change, and this idea of taking action in a game and taking action in a digital space and transitioning that into real world action. And this notion of moving people away from building awareness in a media space to taking action in the real world space. And we'll talk a little bit more about that and how to do that effectively in games in detail in this presentation. Motivation, obviously games are a huge motivator to get people to consume a massive amount of content. If you think about the numbers of hours that people put into playing games, just because they want to beat a level, just because they want to level up, just because they want to beat their own score, it can be incredibly motivating, and there's a lot of psychological factors that come into play here. And good game design will use that motivation to keep people playing through and pushing them through the game experience. And this idea of ubiquity, games are really everywhere now. When I was growing up, we had Nintendo game stations that were the only place that you could play games at home. If you wanted to play games elsewhere, you had to go to a physical game arcade, if you guys remember what those are. And this idea now that everybody has devices, everybody has mobile phones, you can play games anywhere. They're online, they're in the classroom, they're at the library. Games are really accessible, and this idea of accessibility is immensely huge, but also can be a little bit intimidating. And as you can see here, there's a lot of options in terms of technology and platforms, and we'll talk a little bit later about how to make the right decision on how to choose what platforms to pursue. And a lot of it has to do with where your audiences are, what they're using, what their technology preferences are, and things like that. We'll talk about that in some more detail. One of the things that, there's lots of great things about games, and I think a lot of people can make the arguments that games can be and have been really successful in classroom spaces and different interventions. But there are also a lot of challenges with the production of games, and the distribution of games can be incredibly hard to navigate if you're new to the space. So we'll talk a little bit about some of these challenges and risks, and then the design process that I'll work you guys or explain with you guys will really kind of address these different challenges and risks. So I think that a lot of people have heard the chocolate-covered broccoli metaphor, this idea of how do we make games that are learning games or educational games or behavior change games fun. And there's going to be a tension between the balance of fun and content, and finding that right balance is really critical, and it's very important. One of the things that we see and we hear a lot in especially classroom games and education games is that they don't feel like they're fun and they don't feel educational, so they're not really doing anybody any favors. And so how do we get to those better games that are actually really compelling, really engaging, bring people in, bring participants in, and make people want to come back and play more? And how do we get to that level of design? The complexity of the ecosystem. Obviously, choosing technology is a big decision. Deciding whether or not to create content for a PC versus a mobile device is very different in terms of interface design. It's also very different in terms of technology and tool design. Mobile devices come with a lot of embedded tools that can be integrated into the gameplay, and that tie into gameplay that could not necessarily translate over into PC or web designed games. Similarly, you've got a number of different commercial game platforms which are traditionally used in the entertainment game space, but have a very high level of accessibility in terms of reaching certain audiences. And so those might also be an interesting choice to look at. Designing content for all of these platforms is usually the thing that we are requested when we work with clients and partners. They want it on everything. They want to make a game that anyone can use anywhere, but that obviously comes with a cost. So you have to prioritize and really think about not what your preferences are, but what your audience preferences are. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. Engaging qualified teams. This is also a media that requires people coming from different backgrounds, and to collaborate together, you have to have teams of engineers and creative types working together, which can often be conflicting in terms of their priorities and how they work together. You have content writers and subject matter experts who are going to be informing on how to correctly message and explain things. You have assessment experts who are going to be determining the level of success and measuring success for your game. You have game designers, developers, programmers, audio designers, architects, etc. So there's a huge team of people that need to come together for this. And if you haven't built a team before, it's usually smarter to go to an existing game development studio and bring them in and use them as a partner and work closely with them. Many of the clients that we work with have no game design experience. They have a passionate idea or a game concept they want to execute, but how do they get from that game concept to a fully finished game? It's going to require a team. Where does that team come from? Typically, I would not necessarily recommend people trying to build their own in-house team unless they have experience managing and building game development teams. It can be incredibly difficult to find the right resources, and even things such as programming language or tool sets that different team members use, those can all be, those will all attribute to what type of team makeup and what type of execution is possible. The business models in the game space have also been a little bit shaken up in recent years. This games as a service model, which typically you would see in games like Farmville, which are played over longer periods of time, are consumed over longer periods of time. It requires ongoing maintenance, ongoing enhancements, reboots of content, additional levels design, which means that you don't just launch a game and then reap the fruits of the success of its launch. You have to continue working on it after that launch. That game as a service model is very interesting and successful as a business model, but the development costs associated with it should definitely be considered and traded off when thinking about that as an approach. Similarly, the game as a product model is one that has been around for years, but in our specific space, it can be fairly nuanced in terms of distribution. In the commercial games industry, you can distribute games out to through the publishers. We don't have traditional publishers or a publishing model in this space, so producing games as a product also has to be very much informed in where the audience is going to be consuming that product, what the context is of that use, and how that's going to be integrated into a distribution plan specifically for that audience. So successful learning games are hard to produce. I think we probably all understand that. But just to kind of reiterate it, not only does it have to be working software, not only does it have to be engaging as a game, but it also has to successfully teach a skill or convey impact objective. And that can be very difficult, and kind of packaging that all together can be a hard and complex system. So we at Games for Change have put together a system for actually going through the design process, thinking through the audience, and mapping out kind of a critical strategic map that helps define not just the concept of the game, but also specifically addresses the use cases and the technology and the development plans that go around that game concept. So this Games for Change 8-step methodology is available on our Games for Change website. So if you want to see this presentation in just the 8-step deck, you can find that there. But basically the steps are intended to kind of force people to think about critical stakes in their concept and design before they actually get to thinking about gameplay. And if I can highlight here with my mouse, you can see that the gameplay, the actual design, it doesn't come till step 6. And that is because a lot of the things that come before that are going to be constraints that need to be considered in the design itself. So we'll kind of talk through that. For today's presentation, I am going to use a project that we are just wrapping up right now, which was under the Half the Sky movement umbrella as a case study, just to give you guys some kind of deeper understanding and context here. So if you aren't familiar, Half the Sky was a book that was written by Nicholas Kristof and Cheryl Wudunn. It is a book about women's empowerment and gender inequality across the globe. It was then created into a documentary film and a series of educational videos, all kind of featuring the issues and the content of Half the Sky. So Half the Sky, we launched it 3 years ago. We had a lot of game players. We had a lot of donations made on behalf of the game through the game mechanisms. We did a lot of testing and evaluation and surveying, and have been able to obtain really great measurable impact, which we love. That's what we're all about. But how do we get to this point? We started with a game idea. We started with this notion of making a game about these topics covered in a book. How do we get from there to here? So the first thing we did is we wanted to think about audiences. When we were approached by Nick Kristof, he specifically wanted to reach new audiences. He felt that his own book and his work writing for the New York Times had reached specific audiences that then had followed him to the documentary and would be the same type of audiences. And so he really wanted to think of this as reaching beyond the choir and reaching out to these new audiences. So in the context of Half the Sky, in addition to kind of reaching these global audiences, we then specifically designed games for audiences in India and Kenya. And because we were designing for these three kind of separate unique audiences, we had to make a lot of considerations around what we did with the design of our games, how we chose the platform and the technology for our games, and what content and how we actually built the games in terms of their design. The audiences that we chose, we also decided we were going to build different games for those audiences, and that is because the context of those audiences are very different. When we're talking about Western culture and audiences in the US, we're really talking about educated audiences who have access to technology, who are, for the most part, fully literate. And we wanted to ensure that in addition to building content for those audiences, we were also reaching these audiences in India and Kenya, many of whom we understood and we knew that would be, oh, sorry, hold on. Exit it out, let's see, nope. Apologies, there we go. That the audiences in India and Kenya had very special and nuanced needs that we needed to address, and specifically the access to technology, the access to internet connectivity, and literacy literacy rates were all issues that we needed to address. So in doing this, we also realized that we needed to create separate experiences to target these different audiences. So in India, we ended up designing mobile phone experiences that were basically going to be distributed to families through frontline healthcare workers who were traveling to areas where institutionalized healthcare was not available. The games and the design of the games themselves, we knew they needed to be mobile, we knew they needed to be downloadable, and we knew they needed to live on these small feature phones, which, if you guys recall, Nokia phones from 1990 when we first started getting phones here, those are the devices that they were using when we went and started evaluating our audiences and looking at how they were using and consuming media. And so this idea of creating a small, simple mobile game on these smaller devices was going to be important for them because this was the only access they had to technology to consume these games. You can see here, this is actually an interesting story. This is a photo from one of our partners in India who was working with the discussion groups that we had used to discuss different attributes of the game. And they had reported back to us that the women that they were working with were so unfamiliar with the technology that they were hesitant to actually hold it. So what you're seeing here is the ladies that were in the discussion group were actually putting the device on the ground to play the game because they didn't feel comfortable with the technology itself. So this is the level of kind of thinking that we need to do around the design when it comes to creating experiences for these different types of audiences. Similarly, if you're creating content for consumers at home, it's a very different type of thing than creating content that's going to be consumed in the classroom. If you think about classroom management and how teachers address students and need to be able to kind of be in charge, you have to give them game experiences that they can queue up and start and know that the students will get through and be familiar enough with in a 30-minute session, which would be a typical classroom session. So these are the types of things that we think about and we want to integrate into our design. The next thing we think about is impact, and this is really getting to, after the person plays this game, what happens? What happens next? They learn something, they have a behavior change, they have an attitude change, they sign a petition, they make a donation. What is the reason they're playing this game? And we try to get people to define this as clearly and as detailed as possible, because later when we're trying to measure success, it's this impact is the most important thing, and having that clearly articulated as a theory of change is very helpful. So in Half the Sky, getting back to our case study, there was a number of different issues that were covered in the book, and we really wanted to cover as much of them as possible and make sure that we were being comprehensive in showcasing these as issues that were not just issues abroad, but issues that happened right here on our own, in our own backyard. And we also wanted to make sure that people understood the gravity of some of these issues. If you see some of these issues at the bottom here, early enforced marriage, sex trafficking, gender-based violence, these are incredibly tough topics to talk about, and furthermore tough to integrate into a gameplay setting. And so we grappled with how to unravel these issues into impact goals. And again, knowing that we had different audiences we were trying to reach, we decided that the best approach was to think of it as a pyramid of impact, where at the very base level, anybody who would engage with our games would build some level of awareness. Above that, we wanted, a subset of those people to follow up that awareness by taking action, by really making change in their life, by following through with either a prompt or a opportunity to take an action in the real world. We also wanted to raise awareness towards the organizations and the efforts that different nonprofits were making around these issues. So we wanted also to collect donations and be able to raise donations for those organizations that were helping address these issues across the globe. And then at the very top, we wanted to see behavior change, and we wanted to actually see how we could impact people through longitudinal studies. We wanted to see how effective the games could be in creating true behavior and attitudinal change. And through that, we actually did formal assessment. And I'll share more about that when we get to that step. But the idea here was that we didn't want to just have one single goal for impact. We wanted to kind of have levels, and this idea of using these different levels of impact, we could then address and integrate into the game experiences different design elements to allow for this. So for example, when we started building the Facebook game that we built, we knew that we wanted to leverage the Facebook monetization engine, which allows people to make payment transactions within a game setting. And we wanted to use that specific monetization to achieve a donation mechanism. And so we flipped the traditional model of using these monetization tools in Facebook, and instead switched it so that the in-player gameplay would be working towards raising donations for our partner organizations. So I'll talk a little bit more of that and show you some examples when we get there. But again, we very specifically broke these up into features within the gameplay. We then knew that we wanted to, again, covering a range of topics and issues that had a number of different details and complexities to it that we wanted to address. We felt that the most powerful way to build empathy around these issues was through a narrative formatted gameplay. And so we took the different stories and we actually went through the entire Half the Sky volume. We pulled out every story and we worked with our subject matter experts to identify all of the core stories and the storylines for every single level in the game. So what you're looking at here, each of these sections represents a single scenario in our game, and we had 33 scenarios in this Facebook game. These were each addressing a different topic, and then these were then laid out across our game so that they would be covered in different countries, so that we could showcase how these different issues are addressed in different parts of the world, how different cultures respond to these different issues, and also to really showcase that these are global issues. These just don't happen in one place. So you can see a number of these kind of storylines that we started blocking out in terms of how to draft our narrative and map that to the different types of stories that were included in the book. We then broke down those stories even further into what the story arcs and summaries would be, what the topics involved would be, who the characters and who the target characters are going to be. And so this was all content mapping that we did to specifically align our impact goals to the narrative elements, to the character developments and storylines, ensuring that we also had a good balance between the issues themselves and what we were addressing and what levels. We knew that we had to be careful about addressing and introducing certain topics because they were sensitive, and so we had to be very careful about where we introduced those and how they were introduced through the characters and the storylines. Again, so this was all mapped out through spreadsheets before we even get to the design of the game. Platform is the next piece that we frequently have people come and they have made decisions around technology and platform before they actually have thought through the design and the experience of the game. And we typically would tell people to kind of reverse their thinking and think through the technology first. Platform can be, it can be restrictive in terms of what you do, and it can also give opportunities to use hardware and tools that may not exist in other platforms. So it's an important decision. For Half the Sky, again, knowing that we were trying to reach different audiences, we were looking at multiple platforms. To reach our global audience, we understood that Facebook at that point in time was going to be the most effective for us. We wanted a social experience that could be used as a catalyst for discussion. And again, we also wanted to make use of the game monetization engine capabilities. What you see here is we actually had a impact. We measured the impact that players made in the game, and then through their gameplay, they actually moved towards unlocking a free donation from Johnson & Johnson. In addition, they also have opportunities to make purchases, to upgrade and give themselves boosts, to do a number of different things. So really tying in the social features, the social elements, the ability to invite friends, we knew that this was going to be important to reaching that global audience. At the same time, we also wanted to specifically address these audiences in India and Kenya. And with those, again, we targeted Nokia phones. In the course of the project, since we began and where we are today, the Nokia and feature phones, so these are feature phones, are the ones with buttons, not touch screens, that we used to have. The use of feature phones has actually decreased significantly. And so anybody who is thinking about making content for developing countries and developing worlds, really Android devices are now the primary target device for those audiences. So this isn't necessarily reflective of where we are today, but at the time, these Nokia devices were the primary devices being used by these audiences. And we knew that in order to get content onto them, we had to be incredibly selective with the content that we chose for it. So we targeted 3 very specific issues here. So different from the Facebook game where we tried to target over 30 different issues and we had storylines for everything. Each of these 3 games specifically targets one issue. So the first game, Worm Attack, teaches children about intestinal worms and the pills that they can take to prevent them. The second one, Family Choices, teaches girls and their families about the role of girls and women in the family. And then 9 Minutes is a pregnancy health game that teaches young expecting mothers how to care for their baby. And so the reason we needed to target such specific content for these types of games is that each of these games were less than 200 kilobits, which if you think about the size of an email, it's about equivalent to the size of an email. So these are incredibly small games. We couldn't use any audio in them. They do have full animations and they're fully playable arcade games, but we had to be incredibly restrictive in terms of what we could do with the design because the platform itself was so small and had such little memory. So again, thinking through this and understanding this helped us with scoping the design, getting to the feature set, and really focusing on making sure that these game experiences would be enjoyable on these devices. So we talk a lot about financials. Games can be an incredibly expensive endeavor. Part of it is that they're subjective in nature to design, so they never quite feel finished if somebody doesn't like it. And so the financials can be a very sticky place. But in general, we try to encourage people to start with small budgets, build prototypes, test with audiences before you spend your whole entire budget building out a huge game experience. It can be incredibly risky to build out a game and then test with audiences after the fact and find out that they don't find it fun, or they don't find it engaging, or that the game itself is a distraction from reaching those impact goals. So there's a lot of things that need to be evaluated before you jump right in and spend a lot of money. When we worked on Half the Sky, we were able to obtain funding from a number of funders, and we had to really create, well, it's a little pixelated there, but had to create a network and partner with a number of different groups to seek that funding. Games for Change we work under a nonprofit model, so we are able to seek foundation funding that potential for-profits would not. In that case, and for those that are looking for funding and are interested in looking at funding, there's a lot of funding out there for private foundations, the MacArthur Foundation, Bill and Melinda Gates, especially around education and technology. So those would be places I would look first. National Endowment of the Arts has recently started putting out grants for folks to seek funding. The other model, of course, is to look at a for-profit model and thinking about how to seek angel funding and early funding to get you to the point where you can build a prototype and use that prototype to then seek additional funding. When funders and when stakeholders can see something that is built, they have a lot more to respond to. They can see where the direction of things are going. They can get on board. It gives them something tangible. So we recommend this. We often work with groups that either have no or little funding early on, and so they need advising on how to navigate and make sense of what to do with that funding. The number one thing we would recommend is pursue that prototype, something that is playable. It doesn't have to be fully executed. It can be spaghetti behind the scenes. It doesn't need to actually be fully functional, but it just needs to be enough to be able to share a demo and give the essence of the experience, that core experience. And so that can be incredibly effective in terms of obtaining the financials. When it comes to budgeting, there's a huge range in budgets that we see in terms of spending. But I would say that the majority of the games in our space are usually in the $50,000 to $250,000 range. It's less frequent that you see games that are in the $500,000 to $1 million range, which is where we're trying to push funding in that direction, because we see that there's obviously better execution when there's higher budgets. And then, obviously the commercial games industry has its own entire tier and approach to games development, but you're looking at, in some of the commercial game spaces and circles, games that are developed for, at costs of $1 million and higher. Certainly some of the big game franchises. But that's not to say that a great quality and interesting and engaging game cannot be created for $2,000 or for free over a weekend with someone who's devoted and interested. So anything is possible. And what's really important when going to have discussions around financials is being locked in and very, very definitive about what your goals are for the game itself. Distribution goals, not just the game and getting the game developed, but also how are you going to market this game to your audiences. And a lot of times we see that people fail and they forget to think about this when they're considering their finances in the beginning. And so they create a really lovely game, they get to a point where they want to share it with everybody, they're super excited, and they've run out of budget. And so again, thinking about the holistic approach to designing and distributing the game is very important. We now get to gameplay, and this is where I'll dig in a little bit deeper around the Half the Sky game that we built, just to showcase a little bit of kind of our thinking and our design thinking around this. We started early on knowing that we wanted to represent a number of different narratives and a number of different scenarios through the lens of these different characters. And so we looked at a lot of different art and started with our characters because we knew that they were going to be central to the composition of our game. We tried several different layouts. We actually worked with one of our partner organization that works with women in Harlem who have been victims of sex trafficking. We had been working with them to be recipients of donations made through the game. And so we decided to invite some of the women that were living in the shelter to participate and work with us on creating character designs, creating costumes. So we were able to engage our partners in that way, which was really, really exciting. And in the end, we created a whole line of characters that we could tell these different stories through. And the idea was that we wanted to have a single central character. So we named our main character Radhika. And the story follows Radhika from her moving from a role of being oppressed into a role of opportunity, and how she kind of moves in that way from empowering herself to then empowering her family, and then eventually empowering her community. And so this notion that anybody at any place in their life has an opportunity to make change in their life and to move themselves into a position of opportunity is a message that we wanted to convey. And we really wanted to have this be a positive message, even though we were discussing negative issues and issues that were incredibly graphic and painful to discuss. We still wanted the game experience to be a positive one. And so that was one that we wanted to do through these characters. We then started working on layouts. We wanted to have a map environment that could be navigable so that you could enter different locations and experience different characters in those locations. We then started mapping out multiple map locations so that you could travel around the globe in our gameplay. We didn't want to focus on one specific area, so we targeted several different countries, including the United States, which was really important to us because the US was not a central focus of the novel or the documentary, and some of the criticism that they received was around the fact that it was positioned that these issues are issues that happen over there instead of issues that are actually global and all of our issues. We then started looking at lots of reference art and getting down to kind of designing and mapping out our locations. I believe this is, we did some mapping for our Vietnam location here. And you can see some of the sketches, early art that we did. Then knowing that our gameplay was going to be taking place on these interior locations between characters, we then did our mapping of the interiors for the game. So again, this is all kind of creating lots of visuals, getting kind of the elements of the game together, but really defining the gameplay. What we knew we had to do was take our central character, Radhika, and position these different issues through the lens of the characters around her. So for example, the first scenario in the game, Radhika is working with her children who are helping her learn to read because she had never learned to read. And so the first challenge is, you know, this learning and learning about literacy, but also through the lens of her children who are educated, teaching her to read. So it's incredibly powerful. We then set up our different scenarios and wrote a large number of scripts. I think we had, you know, over 300 separate individual scripts for our different characters. And this was something that I'll discuss the testing that we did a little bit later, but we knew that in writing this, we were taking a lot of risks. We were introducing topics and content that was going to be uncomfortable for some people, was going to be too graphic for some people. And so we also knew that we had to test and do a round of testing with these. And what ended up happening was we ended up revising a significant number of our scripts at the very last minute after we did some beta testing, because what we had received in terms of feedback was that the positioning of the game itself seemed like it was positioning men against women, and that the tone of the game seemed to be critical of men, and we really didn't want that. We didn't feel that we needed to be critical of men, and we felt that men are part of the solution. So we actually went back and rewrote a lot of the scripts to position the male characters more favorably, to give more emphasis around the fact that they're part of the solution, and also to not specifically depict the male versus women as kind of the central issue. The other thing that we did as part of our design for this was we knew that in order to convey the seriousness and the complexity around these issues, we had to show the different meaningful consequences around some of the decisions that were made. So we didn't want to make the decisions and the choices in the game easy. We specifically wanted the choices to feel like there might, in some cases, be too bad choices, too uncomfortable choices, where you have to actually make a sacrifice. Because one of the things we felt was really important to convey was, you know, it's not for lack of empathy or lack of caring or lack of want that some of the people in these scenarios are faced with difficulties. And it's not that they don't want to feed their child, and it's not that they don't want to get the medicine. It's that they have to make a choice between what they can afford. And so making these really consequential choices a main part of the gameplay was really important to us. So how did we balance that gameplay and content? And this is where we get to the chocolate-covered broccoli, right? We don't want it to taste like really obvious content that's been slapped over with some gameplay and now it's supposed to be fun. We wanted a really compelling and engaging experience. And so again, we went back to our storylines and we made sure that in each of our different scenarios, the objective was delivered through the narrative, but that the gameplay was also married with a mini game activity. And so if you jump to the main gameplay, and I'll kind of describe a little bit here, the gameplay itself is that you can navigate the space, you can go into the different locations, you interact with the characters within, and then they basically send you on a mission to either find something, to recruit somebody, to collect things. And so in those activities that you're sent to do, we then created a mini game activity experience that could be played and kind of lighten up the gameplay experience. So we married the narrative elements of the game to the activities done in these mini game activities. And you can see this is a match 3 game mechanic that's very popular. And the idea is these quick little mini game sessions are interspersed between the narrative to break up the narrative and give moments of fun gameplay. We also integrated opportunities to make donations in the game, and this is something we felt was really important. Throughout the game and the narrative, we also highlight the different organizations that are working to address these issues. And so we prompt the player at different moments to provide donations, but we also give opportunities to unlock sponsored donations. And so in this case, this is an opportunity to unlock a sponsored donation that is being given to the Fistula Foundation. And these donations were given to us by, sponsored by Johnson & Johnson. And so the idea was that any player playing this game would have an opportunity to make that real world change just through playing the game, even if they didn't want to make an actual donation. And here's another free gift we had around books that we did. And so we had a trigger where you could donate a free book. And again, kind of how do we know it's fun? So we have all these elements and we have all these features and we start pulling things together and then we try to figure out if it's actually any good. And so the one thing that I would reiterate, and I think for any of you who are familiar with developing content, the notion of testing and getting feedback and iterating on the design is so important. And it really is the difference between a successful and engaging game and one that is not. And so what we did is we did a large beta testing with our Facebook game, and as well as beta testing with the mobile devices. We sent devices over to communities in India and Kenya and sought their feedback, and then made changes based on those feedback. And some of them were things like character hairstyles, other things were language and vocabulary changes, other things were just things around confusion and not being sure of what was supposed to be done at certain points in time, adding additional instructions in and putting clarity into places where we needed it. So this was something that we did in terms of before getting this to a place where we feel comfortable with launching, we wanted to get it to a place where we felt that our audience would feel comfortable with the gameplay. This is another point that I think a lot of people get a little sidetracked on sometimes. We often hear that people will approve and finalize and distribute and launch a game because they liked it and they thought it was fun and it was what they wanted, but the target audience didn't agree. And so it's really important to remind yourself that the feedback you're getting from your target audience is actually more valuable than your own particular feedback if you're not that target audience. So when we get to execution, now we have our game idea, we've defined our audience, we've put together our impact goals, we've assigned a platform, we know what our financials look like. Now how do we get this game off the ground, and what does this look like in terms of building a game? Again, for Half the Sky, we had a huge number of partners. And this is partially because we were building a number of different games. So some of these partners were for some of the games, some were others. We also had NGO partners who were recipients of donations through the games. We had launch partners who helped us with the promotion and outreach and cross-promoting and advertising. And then, you know, our production partners, Frima, we worked with a game development studio that was out of Canada. We selected them because they had a lot of game experience designing games for specifically on the Facebook platform, and they had a lot of knowledge around the API that Facebook uses, and so that was incredibly valuable to us. And they'd had a lot of commercial success building games in this space. So we selected them because we knew that they would be able to kind of produce the quality and the level of quality that we were looking for to compete in that space. And then we had matching contributors. And so this idea of building a team is not just thinking about the game design team, but also the team of partners that we would need for distribution and publicity and partnering, also on the matching contributions and sponsorships. So the execution for this particular project was very massive. We were working on a portfolio of games. If you're in a more focused scenario and you're producing and launching a single game, the partners that you're really thinking about kind of break into these different funnels, right? You're gonna have a funding entity, or you're the funder. You're gonna need a production partner, or you're the partner. In this case, again, if you're not a game development studio, we would recommend that you partner with a game development studio, because why try to learn expertise when you can hire it? But the idea is, you know, again, if you can find a team that can work with you and you feel comfortable with, the most important decision you're going to make around execution is who that game developer is. Then you're going to need subject matter experts. In this case, we had NGO partners who were working with us across the different topics. But if you are working on a specific game topic, you might bring in a single subject matter expert or content expert who can inform on how to present information, on the language, how to explain things. You'll want to get them involved early and involved in the design process. And the idea is that your subject matter expert is the person that you're going to lean your designer against. Your designer is going to push for the gameplay and for the fun, and your subject matter expert is going to counteract that with their needs for conveying content and information. And that's where there'll be a tension, but you'll want to find that balance. And then the last part is, you know, your launch partners, your communications and advertising partners. Thinking through who your marketing channels might be, or who partners for launch might be, is also helpful to do at the beginning of your development, because there might be things that you want to build into your game to help support. So for example, we're working with Sunshine Sax right now on another project that we are going to be launching next month. And one of the things that they requested was for us to embed some software into the game itself that helps us track advertising and track which ads send people to the game. If we had known that when we were in development, we could have had our development team do that as part of their development cycle. So that's, you know, something, again, like if we hadn't been able to involve Sunshine Sax sooner, they could have helped inform part of the feature set that we were building into the game from the beginning, rather than going back and addressing it after the fact. So when it comes to assessment, and this is really critical in our space, and it's something that doesn't get talked about enough, this idea of how do you measure the success for your game. It's incredibly important in this space. You know, if we're claiming that our games are for social impact, or our games are for behavior change, we have to be able to demonstrate that, and we have to be able to prove that it in fact does what we say it does. And so thinking through how the game is going to be evaluated at the design phase, before you actually get into building anything, is also really helpful. You can embed technologies into your game. You can create features that allow for easier collection or other attributes. In a similar sense, you also can work with your assessment and monitoring and evaluation team to specifically define what needs to be assessed, and then as you're designing the game, specific elements of that can be addressed in the design. So when we were designing for the Half the Sky game, we knew that there was a lot of analytics that we could draw from the Facebook game. Facebook itself has a powerful analytics tool. That's what makes it incredibly successful platform for a lot of advertisers. But it also it enables us to gather demographic information about our players, which is really valuable. So when we were doing evaluation for these games, we knew that a portion of what we were aiming to collect was already readily available through the Facebook platform. However, on the mobile games, there wasn't that same tool, and we needed to actually build in mechanisms and create processes on the ground to conduct surveying and testing, because that wasn't available within the game tool itself. Similarly, this is something where when we're talking about assessment, people often underestimate how costly it can be to do rigorous and scientific evaluation. And so this is, again, when we want people to kind of think about this early on, so that if they need to go back and reconsider their financials or postpone assessment to a later phase, that is recognized, and it's a decision that they've made consciously, as opposed to getting to the end and realizing that they can't do what they want to do. Assessment obviously is critical if you want to get your games into classrooms. Assessment is critical if you want to have your games used as health interventions. In certain funding models, if your funder requires an evaluation as part of the project, you're going to need to do that. So there's several different types of assessment. There's several ways of assessing things. But again, going back to your main impact goal and understanding what your specific goals are and figuring out ways to assess each of those separately is the first way to kind of approach it. And then what we did for our games was, again, knowing that we had a Facebook game and 3 mobile phone games to evaluate, we needed to work with our monitoring and evaluations team to determine what indicators we were going to use for the different game tools. And then once we determined which indicators we're going to evaluate, figuring out what processes we needed to put in place to make those indicators available. As I said, the Facebook game had a lot of analytics that were available to us. What was interesting was, over the course of the 2-year project that we were doing on Half the Sky, this was specifically through some funding with USAID, we saw that the Facebook analytics tool was reporting its own data differently and inconsistently. And so what ended up happening was the indicators that we were pulling from Facebook became less reliable. And so we needed to create mechanisms to work around that, and added in some additional features into our games. Likewise, with the mobile devices that we were deploying in India and Kenya, one of the biggest issues was that we had no way of evaluating how many gameplay sessions were played after the games were installed on a device. And so we needed to go back and look at our indicators and reevaluate how to make sense of those and how to gather those in a way that would be meaningful for our monitoring and evaluation. And at this point, we are still awaiting our final evaluation for this project, and we're expecting that to come at the end of this month. But we're really excited that we were able to get through as much as we have in the past 2 years with all of this. And this is, again, bringing us back to how do we get to that impact. And so I've kind of shared the full story of how we kind of evolved our design thinking and using this process to kind of think through how we get from our game concept to making this type of impact. And that's all I have for today. And
Emily, thank you. Thank you so much. That was a fantastic presentation, very comprehensive, going from the all the, the really great uses and why games are such a good point, and then going, talking us through step by step the entire process. That was really helpful. Thank you.
Great. And I realize I only have a few minutes left, but if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer.
There's no questions at this time, but I do see that you put your email address there. So I will encourage anybody that's either watching live or is going to be watching a recorded version of this to, feel free to email Emily or email us at adult.literacy@xprize.org. We will be glad to pass along the questions and try to get you answers.
Very exciting.
I know. Thank you so much. We really appreciate this. I'm going to send this out to all of our teams so they will be able to check it out later. And we appreciate you spending the time today.
Great. Well, thanks, everybody, and look forward to hearing from you all.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.